Coming off their best season in decades that ended in heartbreak, the Mets were right back in the mix in 2007, looking bound to have a chance to avenge the previous year with a 7-game lead with 17 games left. But then they would collapse, losing the division to the Phillies in one of the most heartbreaking collapses in MLB history. So let's look at how that collapse happened and where it ranks amongst the worst of all time.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
To understand the pain of the collapse of 2007 further, you have to go back a year. 2006 seemed to be the Mets' year, as they went into the playoffs with the best record in the league at 97-65, winning the first NL East title since 1988. Led by David Wright, the front office pulled off some great moves. Carlos Delgado was brought in to add power to the lineup, Mike Piazza's replacement Paul Duca gave them stability behind the plate, and Billy Wagner locked down the ninth, while veterans like Julio Franco, Jose Valentin, and Eddie Chavez rounded out the roster, while young arms like John Mayne provided depth. In April, the Mets stormed out of the gates with a 16-8 record. Xavier Nady set the tone with a 4-hit performance on opening day, and May brought even more success. June was their shakiest month, but even then, they finished 15-12, and no one in the East came close to catching them. But the first impact of the next season came in September. Pedro Martinez went down with a torn rotator cuff, an injury that would sideline him for most of the following year. And just days later, Orlando Hernandez tweaked his calf, and he was ruled out as well, losing two key pieces of their rotation, who also had tons of prior experience pitching in the postseason. But they still had the best odds going in, and looked like they weren't going to be effective from the start, as in the NLDS, they would sweep the Dodgers in 3 games. And the Mets remained the favorites going into the NLCS against the Cardinals, who only won 83 games. But they had experience, and they were on a roll. Each team won 1 game on the road through 6, setting up for a winner-take-all Game 7. And that Game 7 gave Mets fans great memories, along with terrible memories. Oliver Perez faced off against Jeff Suppan, and the Mets finally scored off him with a David Wright RBI single in the first. But the Cardinals would tie things in the second. Both Perez and Suppan were escaping trouble to keep things at 1, and Perez got in trouble in the 6th when Jim Edmonds got on with 1 out. And there came the moment. Scott Rowland hit a drive to the left that looked to be gone, with Jim Edmonds so confident that he rounded second. But then Andy Chavez made one of the greatest defensive plays of all time, by leaping up over the fence to snow cone a ball that was clearly over the fence. He then set himself up and threw out Jim Edmonds at first, who went all out on that not being caught. Chavez would go on to receive 2 curtain calls, as the Mets would load the base in the 6th, as their momentum looked to carry over. But Jeff Suppan would get out of the jam to send things to the 7th still tied. Things remained 1-1 going to the 9th, and after Jim Edmonds struck out, Scott Rowland hit a single. Then up came Yadier Molina, someone who hit just .216 with 6 home runs that season. So things still looked good with the bottom of the order up. That is until Hyman threw a pitch, and Molina drove it to left, right where Rowland hit it earlier. But this time, Chavez had no chance, as the Cardinals now had a 2-run lead. Hyman got the last 2, and in came rookie Adam Wainwright, who suddenly became the closer a month ago. And he got himself in immediate trouble when Jose Valentin and Andy Chavez led off with singles. Wainwright was able to calm down, and he got a huge strikeout of pinch hitter Cliff Floyd, and followed that by getting Jose Reyes to line out, leaving things up to Paul LaDuca. And LaDuca would draw a walk, and up to the plate came the last player the Cardinals wanted to see, in Carlos Beltran. He hit .417 with 4 home runs against the Cardinals in the 2004 NLCS, and he already had 3 home runs here, as he was already cementing himself as one of the best postseason hitters of all time. But the odds were still in the Cardinals' favor, and they went further that way after Beltran fell down 0-2. And with everyone in Shea Stadium holding their breath, Adam Wainwright delivered the pitch of his life, striking out Beltran on a perfect curveball on the outside corner to win the pennant. For the Mets, the loss was absolutely devastating, and the only thing that got fans through it was the promise of the next year. That winter, the front office tried to reload. The Mets chased Japanese sensation Daisuke Matsuzaka, but they lost out to the Red Sox. They went after Barry Zito, only to see him land in San Francisco, which would actually end up being a good thing. Instead, the Mets settled for re-signing Tom Glavine and Orlando Hernandez, and adding veterans like Moises Alou and Damian Easley. They even took a flyer on Channel Park, who did not survive the month. However, the bullpen that was the backbone of the team was gutted. Chad Bradford, Roberto Hernandez, and Darren Oliver all left in free agency. And the Mets made a series of questionable trades, shipping out promising young arms like Keith Bell, Matt Lindstrom, and Brian Bannister for little return. By opening day, the Mets were older, thinner, and far more fragile than the previous team. But still, the talent on paper was enough to dream big. And early on, it looked like the dream might come true. The Mets stormed out of the gate, sweeping the defending champion Cardinals and outscoring their first 4 opponents 31-3. John Mayne emerged as an unexpected ace, winning NL Pitcher of the Month for April, while David Wright kept a franchise record hitting streak alive. And by the end of May, the Mets were rolling, with a 19-9 record and a comfortable lead in the NL East. But June set them back to reality. They faced an unprecedented stretch, 6 straight series against 2006 playoff teams: the Tigers, Dodgers, Yankees, Twins, A's, and the Cardinals. No team had ever played a stretch like that, and they would stumble, dropping 9 out of 12 to begin the run, and by the All-Star break, their division lead had shrunk to just a handful of games. But still, there were reasons for optimism. Jose Reyes and David Wright were MVP candidates, while John Mayen and Oliver Perez led the rotation as Tom Glavine notched career win number 300. In August, they took series from the Diamondbacks and Cubs, two of the best teams in the National League. But a team that had been trending in the right direction over the past years was the Phillies, and they were rolling to enter August. In late August, the Mets were swept in a 4-game set by the Phillies, watching a 6-game lead shrink to 2. And the panic was real, but the Mets answered with 9 wins in their next 10, seemingly putting the division on ice. On September 12th, they sat 21 games over 500, firmly in control of the East with a 7-game lead, and making his comeback was Pedro Martinez. No matter how much time he missed, you cannot say no to Pedro. But then, it would all collapse. It started with a 3-game sweep by the Phillies, and as the Phillies started rolling, the other important part of the collapse, they lost the next 2, and the Phillies were just 1.5 back, and even after winning 4 of the next 5, they were still only 2.5 up. But then they came back home, giving them a chance to disappoint fans in front of them. They were swept by the 4th-place Nationals, they lost a makeup game to the Cardinals, then they lost the first game against the last-place Marlins. And for the first time since May 15th, they were not in first place. But with it all on the line, the Bats showed up for the first time in a while. They scored 13 against the Marlins, while John Mayen shut them out over almost 8 innings. And with help from the Nationals, who were playing spoilers, they clawed back into a tie. And it all came down to the final game of the season. On September 30th at Shea Stadium, Tom Glavine took the mound. And it was a disaster, giving up 7 runs in the first inning, trailing 7-0 before most fans had found their seats. And as the Phillies started about 30 minutes after them, they had to rely on a Nationals win, as it would lose 8-1. But they did not get the help, and the Phillies beat the Nationals to complete their miraculous comeback and steal the National League East. The Mets finished 88-74 out of the playoffs entirely as October was underway, and the Padres and Rockies finished 1 game ahead of the Mets. The Rockies won the tiebreaker, then going all the way to the World Series. The Mets going from a 7-game lead with just 17 games left to nothing. Just 1 year after hopes were dashed in October, this time it happened in September, and the aftermath was brutal. Tom Glavine's meltdown became the lasting image of his Mets tenure as he returned to the Braves for his final season the next year. And that next year saw another late season skid, as for the 2nd year in a row, the Marlins ended the Mets season on the final day, that also being the last game played at Shea Stadium. Things that make the collapse more painful, as they wouldn't have a winning record again until they won the pennant in 2015. But where does it rank amongst late season collapses? There are different collapses based on eras. Before 1969, it was simply 2 pennant races with the best in the AL and the NL making the World Series, making a collapse all that more painful. The 1934 New York Giants were the first team to blow a 7-game lead in September, still holding a 5.5-game lead for the Cardinals with 14 games left. And after the Cardinals took 2 out of 3 against them, they ended 3 games up with just 5 games left. And pretty much the only way possible that it could happen, the Giants lost the last 5, and the Cardinals won the last 5 to win the pennant before going on to win the World Series. And 30 years later, the team responsible for the Mets' collapse in 2007 had what many see as the biggest collapse of all time. The 1964 Phillies, led by Dick Allen and Jim Bunning, had a 6.5-game lead with 12 games left over the Reds and Cardinals. And funny enough, they played those 2 teams down the stretch. They were swept by the Reds, still up 3.5, but things got real when they were swept by the middling Milwaukee Braves, with a 3-game series against the Cardinals coming up. And ready for blood, the Cardinals swept them, the Phillies losing 10 straight to blow a 6.5-game lead with just 12 games left. As the Cardinals won the pennant, then they went on to win the World Series. And every era brought collapses with different circumstances. While we talked about the Mets' 2007 collapse, in the first season of the LCS era, they were on the side they wanted to be on. The 69 Cubs held the NL East lead for much of the season, but they lost 8 in a row as their lead fell to just 2 games. Then emblematic of the curse, a black cat walked in front of the Cubs dugout on September 9th, and they just kept falling, while the Mets finished the season 38-11 and won the division by 8 games, as the Miracle Mets went on to beat the powerhouse Orioles for their first World Series title. Along with their Game 6 comeback in '86, the Mets have been on the highest highs and the lowest lows of comebacks, doing so against supposed cursed teams. And funny enough, the first full season of the LDS era also had a big late season collapse. The Angels had many of these before, but '95 seemed different with the likes of Jim Edmonds, JT Snow, and Tilly Davis. They built an 11-game lead in August, but behind them, the Mariners got Ken Griffey Jr. back, and the Angels were overwhelmed by his aura. They lost 21 of the next 25, still somehow holding a 6-game lead with 2 weeks left. They would lose the next 9, finishing the season 12-44. The Mariners winning the division in a 1-game playoff, with Randy Johnson throwing 150 pitches in that game, in the season that saved baseball in Seattle. And while that was very painful, what makes it the worst for the 64 Phillies is that without that collapse, they will get a direct World Series berth, not holding off on the fact that even without the collapse, they would have had to win at least 1 series before getting to the World Series. That now stretching all the way to 3 rounds for some teams, as a team like the Rangers in 2023 blew a late division lead, but they still had a chance. But there is 1 year before the wildcard game era began, where 2 teams collapsed in both leagues, setting up for the wildest night in MLB history, and you can watch my video about that below.